Walter Lippmann was an American writer, reporter, and political commentator famous for being among the first to introduce the concept of Cold War, coining the term stereotype in the modern psychological meaning, and critiquing media and democracy in his newspaper column and several books, most notably his 1922 book Public Opinion. Public Opinion is perhaps Lippmann's most well-known work. Lippmann begins this book by describing a situation in 1914, where a number of Germans, Frenchmen, and Englishmen were trapped on an island. They have no access to media of any kind, except for once every 60 days when the mail comes, alerting them to situations in the real world. Lippmann explains that these people lived in peace on the island, treating each other as friends, when in actuality the war had broken out and they were enemies. The purpose of the above anecdote is to develop the idea of the world outside and the pictures in our heads. Throughout Public Opinion, Lippmann explains the way that our individual opinions can differ from those that are expressed in the outside world. He develops the idea of propaganda, claiming that in order to conduct propaganda, there must be some barrier between the public and the event. With this separation, there is the ability of the media to manipulate events or present limited information to the public. This information may not match the public's perception of the event. In this way, Lippmann was essentially presenting some of the first views on the mass communication concepts of gatekeeping and agenda setting, showing the media's power to limit public access to information. Public Opinion proposes that the increased power of propaganda and the specialized knowledge required for effective political decisions have rendered the traditional notion of democracy impossible. The phrase manufacture of consent was introduced, which Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman used as the title of their book Manufacturing Consent. Lippmann showed how individuals use tools such as stereotypes to form their opinions. In putting together our public opinions, not only do we have to picture more space than we can see with our eyes, and more time than we can feel, but we have to describe and judge more people, more actions, more things than we can ever count, or vividly imagine. We have to pick our samples, and treat them as typical. Lippmann shows that the public is left with these stereotypical judgments until the media presents limited information to change their perception of an event. Lippmann is showing us that the pseudo-environment that is conveyed to us by the media is the result of a high degree of gatekeeping in the news process. Lippmann recognized that the media was altering the flow of information by limiting the media content that was presented to the public. Furthermore, Lippmann presents the idea of agenda setting, as he recognizes that the mass media is the link between individual perceptions of a world and the world that actually exists. Lippmann shared the general 1930s elite skepticism about the ability of average people to make sense of their social world and to make rational decisions about their actions due to the discrepancies that necessarily exist between the world outside and the pictures in our heads. Because these discrepancies were inevitable, Lippmann doubted that average people could govern themselves as classic democratic theory assumed they could. The world of the 1930s was an especially complex place, and the political forces were very dangerous. People simply couldn't learn enough from media to help them understand it all. Even if journalists took their responsibility seriously, they couldn't overcome the psychological and social barriers that prevented average people from developing useful pictures in their heads. Political essayist Eric Alterman, when writing about Lippmann, said, Lippmann famously compared the average citizen to a deaf spectator sitting in the back row. He does not know what is happening, why it is happening, what ought to happen. He lives in a world he cannot see, does not understand, and is unable to direct. Journalism, with its weakness for sensationalism, made things worse. Governance was better left to a specialized class of men with inside information. No one expects a steelworker to understand physics, so why should he be expected to understand politics? Though a journalist himself, Lippmann did not assume that news and truth are synonymous. For Lippmann, the function of news is to signalize an event, the function of truth is to bring to light the hidden facts, to set them in relation with each other, and make a picture of reality on which men can act. A journalist's version of the truth is subjective and limited to how they construct their reality. The news, therefore, is imperfectly recorded and too fragile to bear the charge as an organ of direct democracy. To Lippmann, Democratic ideals had deteriorated, voters were largely ignorant about issues and policies and lacked the competence to participate in public life and cared little for participating in the political process. In public opinion, Lippmann noted that modern realities threatened the stability that the government had achieved during the patronage era of the 19th century. He wrote that a governing class must rise to face the new challenges. The basic problem of democracy, he wrote, was the accuracy of news and protection of sources. He argued that distorted information was inherent in the human mind. People make up their minds before they define the facts, while the ideal would be to gather and analyze the facts before reaching conclusions. By seeing first, he argued, it is possible to sanitize polluted information. Lippmann argued that interpretation as stereotypes subjected us to partial truths. Lippmann called the notion of a public competent to direct public affairs a false ideal. He compared the political savvy of an average man to a theatergoer walking into a play in the middle of the third act and leaving before the last curtain. Lippmann believed that propaganda posed such a severe challenge that drastic changes in our political system were required. The public was vulnerable to propaganda, so some mechanism or agency was needed to protect them from it. A benign but enormously potent form of media control was necessary. Self-censorship by media probably wouldn't be sufficient. Lippmann's conclusion was that the best solution to these problems was to place control of information gathering and distribution in the hands of a benevolent technocracy, a scientific elite, who could be trusted to use scientific methods to sort fact from fiction and make good decisions about who should receive various messages. To accomplish this, Lippmann proposed the establishment of a quasi-governmental intelligence bureau that would carefully evaluate information and supply it to other elites for decision-making. This bureau could also determine which information should be transmitted through the mass media and which information people were better off not knowing. Lippmann was an early and influential commentator on mass culture, notable not for criticizing or rejecting mass culture entirely but discussing how it could be worked with a government-licensed propaganda machine to keep democracy functioning. In public opinion, Lippmann said that mass man functioned as a bewildered herd who must be governed by a specialized class whose interests reach beyond the locality. The elite class of intellectuals and experts were to be a machinery of knowledge to circumvent the primary defect of democracy, the impossible ideal of the omnicompetent citizen. In his book The Phantom Public, Lippmann recognized that the class of experts were also, in most respects, outsiders to any particular problem, and hence not capable of effective action. Philosopher John Dewey agreed with Lippmann's assertions that the modern world was becoming too complex for every citizen to grasp all its aspects. But Dewey, unlike Lippmann, believed that the public, a composite of many publics within society, could form a great community that could become educated about issues, come to judgments and arrive at solutions to societal problems. The Phantom Public is a forceful critique of what he takes to be mistaken conceptions of the public found in democratic theory, like that it is made up of sovereign and omnicompetent citizens. The people are a sort of superindividual with one will and one mind, or an organism with an organic unity of which the individual is a cell. Lippmann counters that the public is none of those things but a mere phantom, an abstraction embedded in a false philosophy that depends on a mystical notion of society. Democratic theories, he argues, vaguely assert that the public can act competently to direct public affairs and that the functioning of government is the will of the people. But Lippmann dismisses such notions of the capacities of the public as a fiction. The Phantom Public was published in 1925 following Lippmann's experiences observing the manipulation of public opinion during World War I and the rise of fascism in Mussolini's Italy. It followed public opinion and moves further toward disillusionment with democratic politics. The book provoked a response from philosopher John Dewey, who argued in his 1927 book The Public and Its Problems that the public was not a phantom but merely in eclipse, and that robust democratic politics are possible. Today, the exchange between Lippmann and Dewey continues to be important for the critique of contemporary journalism, and press critics such as New York University's Jay Rosen invoke it to support moves towards civic journalism. If you like this video, please give a like and a subscribe.